Good afternoon and welcome to the final SLTI livecast of the academic year. And to mark the occasion, do something a bit different. We've brought in four leading experts in teaching and learning to discuss what excellence means to them in teaching and learning. It's a word that's used quite a lot, and with those kind of words it can sometimes lose its meaning, it can lose its definition or its purpose. So what we're trying to do for the next hour or so is really nail down what that means, how can we achieve it, and even whether we might want to, just to be controversial. So I'll introduce the panel. I'm really pleased to welcome Helen Beetham, who is an education consultant and researcher, expert in digital capability, digital futures and digital resilience, student resilience, and a consultant on national and international digital education projects. We also have Dr. Jane Creaton from the University of Portsmouth, who's a reader in higher education, a contributor to the Professional Doctorate in Education, and project lead on a PGR project around students' wellbeing and mental health. We have Professor Julie Hall, who for our immediate audience needs no introduction, but I will anyway. Deputy Vice Chancellor of Solent University. Very interested in widening participation, academic enhancement and student partnerships, and also a key member of the project team around the formations of gender and higher education pedagogies in Roehampton. And finally, pleased to welcome Professor Rachel Mills, who's the Dean of Faculty of Environmental and Life Sciences at the University of Southampton. I had to read that because I was so many words. You've developed and delivered undergraduate and postgraduate programmes in ocean and earth science, and also led the development on the very successful MOOC Exploring Our Ocean, with another one to come, which has global reach. So thank you all very much. I'm really looking forward and slightly intimidated by talking to you. Really appreciate you playing along. So first of all, just to get your initial thoughts on what does excellence mean to you. So I'll ask you to begin, Jane, if that's all right.
Okay, thanks, Karina. When you set this challenge around excellence, I guess I realised how often I use this word without examining what it actually means and what I mean by it. So for me, I think being excellent is being the best that you can be, or the best that you can do, taking into account the context in which you're in and the resources that are available to you in the learning and teaching context. And I think it is highly contextual. Yep. I'm very interested in the impact of the discipline in terms of what constitutes excellence, particularly across science, social sciences, humanities. So I think it is very specific, and I think it's really specific as well to the institution and the particular part of the sector that you're in. So I'm interested in exploring some of those issues with the rest of the panel.
Excellent.
As the discussion proceeds.
That's great. Thank you very much. Rachel.
So it's something we all aspire to. It's something a word we use a lot. We have it in our strategies, we have it in our websites, we have it everywhere. But actually, again, when I was thinking about this session, defining exactly what it is really, really hard. So we all know it when we see it. So it's something we've all experienced in our past, and we can say that's excellent. But actually measuring it is really hard. Agreeing what it is really hard. And actually quantifying it in any way is really hard. And I'm guessing we're going to talk about all of those things.
I hope so. Yeah, absolutely. And Julie?
So I think I'd like to say two things about it. The first is that I liked Dilly Fung's work on this, actually, and she talked about it being the policy word of the moment, and she talked about whether if we switched the word excellent to something like good, it might help us think more carefully about what we're talking about today. So perhaps later on I can perhaps explore that. But as Deputy Vice Chancellor, I also feel I've got a responsibility to work within that policy framework and for Solent to do as best as it can in that policy framework. So of course we were really excited to get silver in the Teaching Excellence Framework. We're planning a Going for Gold strategy, and so I sometimes feel I straddle between a kind of policy cynic, an enthusiast for good teaching, and also then a senior manager with a responsibility to do my best for the university within that policy framework.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you.
It's hard to follow those. And I guess as a policy cynic, I might say excellent is just a point on a rating scale.
Yes.
But to be more serious about it, I don't use the word a lot in my work, but I do use the word resilience a lot. And I was thinking about the connection between resilience and excellence in learning and teaching specifically. And I was thinking about how our teaching has to prepare students for very uncertain futures, for possibly various kinds of crisis, environmental crisis, crises in democracy and legitimacy, crises in the nature of work that we're preparing them for. And so in order to do that effectively, we're always having as teachers to surpass what we did last year or what we think is safe and normative. So in a sense, just by asking those really deep and necessary teaching questions, we're already in a space of excellence, I would argue. So perhaps for me, excellence doesn't come from the world of business in the sense of continuous improvement, like always having to make a new standard and personal benchmark and surpass what you did last year. It more comes for me from the scholarship of teaching, which would be about asking those questions. What is it necessary to learn now? What is it going to take for my students to learn this, and how can I make it meaningful to them? And I think if we're examining those really difficult and profound questions, we are inevitably reaching beyond what we know how to do already for ourselves as well as for our students. So I would say excellence is very close to what I mean by asking those difficult questions.
Yeah, no, that's really good. All right, so that's a great start, and I think we've got a lot to talk about. One of the things that came through while you were all just talking was the very nature of excellence isn't a fixed thing, it's shifting. And as the world shifts, as the outside context shifts, then so must excellence also shift. So maybe what was excellent 10 years ago isn't good enough anymore because of what we need to do for our students. Would you agree with that?
If I could say something on that, I think the first thing I'd say is that university teaching hasn't really changed too much for hundreds of years actually, and we've still got our lectures and our seminars, and that model, although there's lots of practice around that's a bit different from that, but the kind of core teaching, the timetable we set and so on, is often around that model. So that's the first thing. So we can talk about excellence, but actually we need to admit, I think, that a lot of teaching is very similar to it was many years ago. And I was going to say something else and I can't remember what it was, but that's fine. I'll leave it there for now and I'll come back. I'm sure it'll come back to me. But I wanted to make that point because that is a bit of a frustration of mine that I think we've still got a long way to go to make teaching good. Oh, I know what I've remembered now.
Yes.
Is that right? Sorry.
Yeah, no, go for it.
When I've interviewed so many students in my research, and two things come up time and time again, and that's stood the test of time. Actually, I'd say over 20 years of interviewing students, is a sense of care, and then also a clarity about what's expected, and so that again, that's why I struggle with excellence, because if I have to hand on heart what students told me, where is what happens when the best teaching is happening, it's been those two things in a lot of my research.
Essentially personal connection and communication.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
How hard can it be, right?
I could give a specific example from the research I've done with students about their digital experience. So the lecture keeps coming up, and if I look at the qualitative feedback, there's a lot about lectures, and you could say, oh God, students are just attached to old stuff, but what they mean by lectures actually really changed profoundly. So what students mean by a lecture now starts with the experience of lecture notes being made available. It goes through a live experience, a live encounter with ideas that might include live internet searches, it might include polling, it might include all sorts of live tasks. It then continues with a recording that they might be able to annotate and that they could share with their friends, that they could download and make part of their personal note keeping. So they remain really attached to the idea of the lecture as a mark of excellence. It's a gold standard for them of excellent learning and teaching, but what it means is really different. And I think what I've learned from looking at students' responses around excellence is that, it is for us to identify to them what an excellent university experience looks like. They come with all sorts of preconceptions, but actually, as far as what their learning will be like and how it will be transformative, it really is for us to own that idea with our students, And so, I could say more about how lectures have changed for students, but I do think, it is for us to shape their expectations.
And I mean, just picking up on the fact that, you know, lecturing remains the central form of delivery so long after they started. I mean, there's issue as well, isn't there, about excellence in some contexts being defined as a constant drive for innovation, not necessarily improvement, but it's almost innovation is equated with improvement. And I think there's a lot to be said. I think there's an article I read called, you know, Praise of Maintenance. So as well as the drive for getting better and trying new things, but also to really focus on what works well in those modes of delivery, and to pay as equal attention to making sure that those things are given equal investment, as well as the new shiny exciting technologies. So you were saying the lecture capture and all those type of things, but if those can be integrated with what we know does work and does achieve good results for students, that seems to be perhaps the line that we're walking along.
And I guess I'm more interested perhaps in outcomes rather than we're talking about inputs. So if we think about outcomes, that excellent education experience leads to an inquisitive outcome, people learning for themselves, people actually taking that knowledge and moving through their whole life with that ability to actually move the discipline and knowledge forward. And those of us that are very involved in postgraduate education perhaps can see that more, that our postgraduates are taking that knowledge and those skills that they've learned from your digital interaction with them, and they're using them continuously and improving all the time.
So we've got to think not just about what we mean, but who it's for as well. Because all those different perspectives, I'm hearing the student's perspective of excellence is this, but maybe the academics' perspective of excellence is that, but then maybe there's a management expectation around excellence as well, and these might all be at odds with each other. So how do we support excellence for all when we're talking maybe about 3 different things?
Or more than that.
Or at least 3,
I think I'm really conscious of the metrics often being experienced as a sort of surveillance, and I would much rather they were used for professional reflection, I guess, in a very open way. So that would be a really nice, rich professional conversation with somebody to say, I've looked at my unit evaluations, I'm not quite sure why are 50% of the students saying they're not enjoying my lessons. You know, if somebody felt happy and open to talk like that, I think that could be a fantastic professional approach to developing excellence. And so, you know, I'm very conscious here of sort of treading a fine line around the metrics, so paying a lot of attention to them, but certainly not using them to kind of bang people over the head. And the other thing is as well, with unit evaluations, for example, we know that there's a gender dimension to that, and women lecturers are often not rated as highly as their male colleagues, for example, which is something we have to really pay attention to, I think.
And the same institutional level, I guess, with I guess we'll come on to the TEF at some point, but, you know, in terms of what those metrics can mean, can be the basis for an institutional discussion about why, you know, with the experience of actually going through the delivery, why the metrics coming like that. So despite all the other issues with the TEF we might want to explore, I mean, it does have the opportunity for having those sort of conversations at institutional level, I think, looking on the positive side.
Holding a mirror.
I mean, I think if we, I can say this because I see lots of institutions and I'm not attached to one particularly, but I think the idea, you were talking about focusing on outcomes, and I think the idea of TEF, which was to free institutions up to develop their own processes as long as the outcomes looked right and not to micromanage that process. Unfortunately, I think the way that the emphasis on student satisfaction ratings and the way it's often been implemented has actually led to new processes that are often experienced by staff as being quite stifling of innovation and of freedom to fail and so on. So, I mean, I think we might need to reclaim excellence as a process of an organisational sort of thriving, where we do think about the inputs to professional development, and we do think about the inputs to good peer review, and you know, all those things that make teaching a professional practice where we trust each other, we trust our process, you know, we talk about the solidarity we have as colleagues, and that those things to some extent trusted to produce outcomes, because it feels to me that, you know, to some extent an excellent process has to be values led, because the outcomes of what we're doing are so profound they might not be seen for 5 or 10 years in an individual's lifetime. And given that, You know, it's lovely to have evidence close to hand if it's reliable evidence, but we have to be values-led in our drive to improve, I think the evidence doesn't do enough work for us.
Yeah.
No, that'd be really nice. I mean, you mentioned it, so let's stay with it. The teaching excellence framework, very metrics driven, not too many values in there as far as I can tell. Maybe in the written statement of support, you've got an opportunity to. But how do we reconcile having a culture now, higher education culture, where everything is quantified and impact driven and compared and measured and competing, with space for innovation, for trying things out, such as your MOOC? I mean, you couldn't possibly, I mean, you might have hoped that it would be as successful as it was, but you obviously allowed that space to develop that. But if there was any kind of impact on TEF, for example, of your MOOC not doing so well, would there have been space to do it?
Yeah, and is there enough resource to even do
can
it?
you afford to do it
So I think
on time? Or
so I guess what I've learned is if you want to do some digital innovation, which is really expensive, you know, it's expensive in terms of time and stuff, you have to be able to wring that material out in many different ways. So we use it for, obviously it's for global reach, we use it for marketing our programs and marketing Southampton, we use it for really in-depth sort of access to our discipline, exploring the deep ocean, which is something that people can't do any other way, so they can get in and get an insight to what we're doing. So it's meeting lots and lots of different needs. So I think what I'm trying to say is that while it's demonstrably excellent, but it's actually it's pointing in many different ways for the organisation in terms of meeting its needs and its strategies in education, in research, in internationalisation, in outreach, in engagement, in inclusivity. And I think that's maybe something we could talk about, is how we can actually not just talk about teaching on its own, to talk about it in the wider context of what we're trying to do in universities.
Yeah, that's a really good point. How does it all fit together, do you think?
I mean, I worked in learning and teaching centres for a long time, and some years ago, I suppose you have to be careful what you wish for. I would have loved a Vice-Chancellor or a Deputy Vice-Chancellor who even asked me about teaching, who paid any attention really to assessment methods or, you know, really anything to do with the student experience. and so for me, you know, I think we have to be careful, because TEF has put teaching and the student experience on the agenda for many universities for the first time. And to think of these senior committees now taking these things really seriously and talking about student feedback and so on, you know, that's a good thing. So, you know, while, yes, metrics, you know, are imprecise tools for measuring good quality teaching and are problematic, I'm pleased that this teaching is being taken seriously at the very top of universities, and we are paying attention to the student experience of learning in some ways.
And I worked with the NUS to develop, and various other student representative bodies, to develop a kind of roadmap to an excellent digital experience, and it was based on one the NUS had done about assessment and feedback that you might know. And so it has these columns, and institutions can kind of look at where they are. And the furthest column to the right, because they've taken their cue from the way universities work, is the excellent column. And in all the roadmaps that they've produced, including these two, the column furthest to the right is about students being fully engaged and committed and as co-creators of that experience, so that they're engaged in making choices about how they're assessed, they're engaged in thinking about the kind of feedback they want, and in peer feedback, or in the case of the digital experience, they're empowered to make changes that they want to see, they're empowered to use their own devices, but also to think about how that changes the curriculum. So kind of for the NUS, who've had an opportunity and time and space to think about this opportunity that the student experience kind of offers, they want to be treated as participants and as collaborators. But I think a lot of the time students are used to being addressed as service users, essentially, and particularly when they have to sort of tick a lot of stuff. And so I think we should use this great opportunity that the student learning experience is now critical to an organisation's success and definition of themselves as excellent. But we should also give the time and space for students as well to engage with what that means, rather than just receiving it as, you know, a point on a scale, which is the only power they have to communicate what they think about it. Those kind of student change projects are really powerful ways to do that.
It's quite interesting as well, seeing the various TEF provider submissions, the extent to which students have been involved or not in terms of writing the submission. There's a real spectrum between those institutions which have engaged students right from the outset, and it's quite clear that the student voice is threaded all the way through submission, versus the ones where perhaps it's a little bit more marginal. So again, linking to your point about how this might actually be an instrumental way to get students' voice on the agenda in a way that we hadn't expected, but it certainly seems you know, that's a really interesting thread that's going through the different submissions.
All right. Is there a better way of recognising excellence, do you think? How would we do it if it wasn't for...
It's really hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
So certainly, I mean, the teaching excellence framework doesn't really measure excellence. I'm not sure it measures teaching.
No. Is it a framework?
It is a framework. So again, in preparation for this, I was trying to think how you might measure the outcomes. And you're right, they're massively longitudinal. They're out there for decades. We all remember from our childhood, there's excellent education experiences that probably have got us to where we are today. So it's something about capturing that journey and what are the steps along the way to that independent thinking, that inspirational sort of inquisitiveness that we're looking for. So how do we measure that? I don't have any answers, but I'd really like a discussion about that, about how we actually would measure excellence 5 years out. So for example, that someone's on a trajectory, that they're using the skills they've learned, and they are inspired to and have a framework to understand how to take themselves forward.
That comes back, I guess, to the objective contextual problem as well, doesn't it, in terms of what extent you can do that without taking into account what people's very individual preferences are and the discipline that they're working in terms of what might work in science and arts. And then, I don't know, it seems quite an impossible task to come up with something that might capture all those
But I think if we don't try and think about how we might measure it, and we just start from a place about who are the people we'd need to engage with to have a real good sense of this. For me, they're actually the same people who, in my experience, are the key change agents, and that's early career academics and professionals and late career students. And ironically, they're the people who are kind of most deeply rooted in the subject, the discipline that they've committed to. They feel at the top of their game. They really understand what it is to be a geographer or an oceanographer, whatever it is. But they're also new, they're fresh, they're innovative, they've got new ideas, they've got energy, they're early in their career. They're probably trying to stand out from the crowd. That's absolutely what people at that threshold want to do. And so they're key people for the organisation to develop the kind of transforming excellence we're talking about, not the benchmarking, but the kind of... And unfortunately, very often the early career people are the most precarious and the ones who are most likely to be pushed back if they get a bad student rating or try something new and it doesn't work. And the late career students are often being told to focus on where you're going next. And I think if we could engage some of those late career students as alumni before they actually leave and begin to get them to engage, perhaps their capstone projects could be things that are going to actually make a difference in the university, whether that's to teaching and learning or the digital environment or the estate in some way. A lot of really successful universities actually employ their graduate students who've been interns, and they become part of the organisation. They really have a sense of belonging. If you can begin that journey of alumnus at that point, you have at least a capacity to follow those stories through. If you give those alumni web space for life, if you give them the beginning of the portfolio that will define who they are and how they're going to be successful, you can keep that connection with them all the way through. And again, if you can engage your early career professionals, not just academics, librarians, career, who are exciting and excited and want to make a difference to the institution and give them some time and space, then I think you're talking to the right people to know what difference you can make as an institution. I don't have the answer about measurement because I'm not a big fan of measurement, but I do know we can't measure anything if we've not engaged the right people, and if we're distracting them with, things like where's my next contract coming from, or how do I impress? We need to keep the big picture in view, I think.
And is anyone doing that well? in your
I think there are institutions that are really doing the lifelong engagement bit well. They tend to be teaching intensive, so that they might start by, and actually I know Solent does some, they start by providing a web space for life, and start when students arrive with a portfolio, portfolio-based approach. There's lots of institutions that do really great student change agent work in the final year. They don't say, oh, final year students have to just think about exams. They say, you are our people.
Yeah.
You've committed now, you belong, you know what's wrong and what's right. Come and work with us, and actually creating those kind of opportunities for students to be leading the community, in terms of its learning and teaching. Don't know anyone who's putting it all together. I'm sure it's possible to do. If I racked my brains, I could come up with a few.
Yeah. And I think to counter that, what we've got is professional and managerial employment, haven't we?
Yeah.
And and I really worry about that when we've got a university like here, which is really committed to the local skills agenda, and we've got nurses and healthcare professionals, we've got social workers, we've got creatives, and that whole definition of success being that you've got yourself into a professional and managerial employment, is something that worries me really, as a measure.
Workers are going to look like that in a few years' time.
And the whole discourse about that was out recently about students being overqualified, or they're doing they didn't need to be students to do these. It was almost talking about education as if it was totally superfluous to do a whole load of jobs that weren't in that category, but certainly weren't beyond the standards. So this nation, there's sort of too much education knocking around.
Yeah. We showed some really lovely stats at our open days about a graduate population being more democratic, being able to be less stressed, there's the more sense of well-being, more commitment to working for charities and that kind of thing. And that's got to be a good thing for the country, beyond, precise jobs that people do. I think.
Absolutely. I mean, from what you've been saying, it's very much excellence as we might tend to understand it is about a point in time. Here's a snapshot, this is where we are, this is what we've achieved. Whereas what we're actually looking for is a way of looking at that transformation. It's a process, it's a wave, not a particle. You're looking for movement, and that's going to be different for everybody.
Exactly.
I mean, if you take excellence as objective, then a lot of students are not going to attain it, but for them, for where they might have come from, it could be enormous, and we need to celebrate that as well, that degree of transformation. Is that I feel very radical right now.
Thank you for saying that, Karina. That's fantastic. That's exactly, I think that's exactly it.
Yeah, I mean, not to belittle achievement at all, but we have to recognise that for a lot of students, achieving a degree is amazing.
Yes.
And they've worked very hard for that, maybe where they've come from and where they want to go as well.
Exactly.
And what you mentioned about the managerial and professional, that's also very gendered too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially with a lot of the courses that we have at Solent. I mean, they're very female dominated. So are we screwing up our students in terms of what we're expecting of them? I don't know.
Well, it's interesting being an all-female panel. How do we define excellence? Well, it seems to fall rather more towards the Y chromosome. If you look at the people who actually are leading institutions of higher education, so women are, dominate through every level of education in the UK at least, until you start to get to postgraduate. And then, I think in terms of, we were just discussing what the gender pay gap is, but it's really not very good. And if you look at global leading, defined, in the league tables as globally leading universities, 18% of them are led by women. Well, if we're not making full use of the resources of half the population, then excellence is going to be a difficult goal to attain, I would say. So we do need to be careful about how we're measuring, and maybe if the way we're measuring is leading to some of the results and anomalies we've talked about in terms of student rating as well, then maybe the ways we're measuring are a little bit suspect.
Yeah. Going from radical to angry, so I'm going to move. Let's talk about something a bit more positive. The role of well-being. How does that fit into our understanding of achieving excellence, would you say? That's very
I'll kick off because I'm working on a project at the moment which is looking specifically at postgraduate researcher mental health and well-being, but obviously the ramifications are the same for the undergraduate population, but also for early career researchers particularly, and staff more generally in institutions. So our project is looking at some of the structural issues in academia that lead into those pressures. So we've mentioned about the precarious nature of early career employment, which particularly impacts on postgraduate researchers. But I suppose looking at the issue more widely in terms of how we design, think about, assess programmes, how we might embed the concept of well-being all the way through. So a lot of the issues that we're looking at are things that have been considered as an add-on, but things like pinch points, the nature of assessment and so on, they're things that can and should be embedded in the curriculum development stage, for example, or take into account when we look at what the impact of particular policies might be across the institution. So I think there's lots of scope to embed it in all phases of our current processes. And I think, can something be excellent if attention's not being paid to well-being of either staff or students?
And certainly we're working really hard to embed that well-being philosophy in everything we do when we're designing our new doctoral training programs. Well-being is a requirement now to have a well-being strategy, and we have to be able to articulate that. And so we're seeing massive change in the sort of sector in terms of if you want to get funding, you have from research councils, you have to be able to articulate how you're addressing this. And that's a good thing. And it's been a challenge we've risen to, but I think it's right that we're asked to do that.
And it's doing it in a way that's meaningful as well, isn't it? Rather than just, well, we've put that in place. Everything's good now.
Yes, it's always a danger, isn't it, of sort of evolving to a tick box exercise. But I mean, I guess we're in the early stages, so at the moment there's still the scope to think about and reflect on it properly. So I guess the challenge is to stop it becoming another checklist that needs to be
not
completed.
too separate as well. I mean, not something that happens somewhere else. Because I think it's really, I love what you were saying about how having a degree, actually leads to lifelong well-being. It changes how people vote. It changes what they're likely to do with their spare time. It changes how they feel about their life. And I think we need to see education as a form of well-being, that we're providing, as well as, of course, caring about our students when they're with us and caring that they're in a good place to do the learning that's going to be so challenging for them. And I think it's really interesting, coming right back to the beginning about excellence being disciplinary. I think that as disciplines we should be examining what we think it means to live a good life. I mean, I think that is part of what should be in our curriculum. What kinds of futures do we envisage? We've been talking about work is changing. That doesn't just mean there'll be the latest iPod on the desk. It means that iPad on the desk. It means that how people work and how people don't work is profoundly going to change. What kind of lives people are going to lead. And our students are the ones who are going to be finding the solutions to that and inventing those ways of life. And they need to understand themselves and how they want to thrive and how they want the subjects they've committed to contribute to finding those solutions.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a part of the whole curriculum. It's not a student services issue. It's an issue about what it means to be a graduate, actually.
And what it means to be a member of someone working in academia as either a member of professional staff or academic staff, because a lot of these issues around sort of modelling good practice or bad practice, as the case may be. So a lot of the things we're trying to teach or to talk to postgraduate researchers about are hard to challenge because they're just seen as being accepted ways of working in their particular discipline or department. So it's not something that can just be addressed at the individual level or the student level.
I think anybody watching this live cast who works in a learning and teaching centre will have considered the challenges around helping people consider their practice, but in a way that doesn't demean what they already do, which recognises the excellence that I'm sure is there already, and there's perhaps questions how to get more people involved, how to get more people thinking about doing things differently, and I think it's a huge sort of cultural change job. Sometimes it's not seen like that, but for me it's a really delicate political job, and I'm sure everyone listening to this will understand what I mean, because it's hard being a lecturer, being an academic, and it can be stressful enough without someone in a centre sort of perhaps, you know, making you feel that what you're doing isn't good enough, or even just suggesting to you that your practice needs to change. And that can feel really worrying. And so I think, I mean, I have huge respect for people who work in the units and, you know, try their hardest to help people explore different ways of doing things.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I have to give a shout out because I'm the co-chair of the Association for Learning Development in Higher Education. That's my other role, which is asleep right now, but it's waking up. And it's quite often described, learning development is quite often described as being a third space. So it's working with the students, but also there's a need to work with staff as well. It's all very collaborative. The way that we configure it is collaborative, emancipatory. It's all about partnership working. Is there scope to bring in more of that generally in university? I mean, yes, of course there is. I'm answering my question. Of course there is. That's ridiculous. It should be in everywhere, and I should be in charge of it. But how do we bring in more of this partnership working without making people feel threatened about their competence, really? It's very threatening sometimes to say you need to work with this person. So how could management, I mean, I did write something down about management practices or leadership, which I think you can understand very differently. So is this a management thing or is this a leadership thing, would you say?
It's probably both.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to say.
It's like leadership can come from anywhere, isn't it? And particularly, I think, I don't know so much about the difference between leadership and management as others, but I do want to go back to what you said about learning development, because in the work around students' digital experience, certainly 5-10 years ago, we were all about how can we embed this in the curriculum. That's where students live, is in the curriculum. And actually, increasingly, students' time and the investments that universities make is also in the co-curriculum. And one of the really, one of the questions we asked students in this big survey, we had 60,000 responses internationally, was what they do with digital technology that makes a difference to their learning, that they enjoy, that they feel makes a difference to their learning. And I mapped all of that to Bloom's taxonomy, and I came up with quite a lot of stuff that just didn't fit, and most of it was in the space that learning development sits in. So it was around how I take notes, how I manage my time, how I curate what I know, how I work with fellow students, practices of writing. You know, writing practices have profoundly changed, and ours have too. It's not our students. I mean, we write in a completely different way to how we were taught in school. You know, and all of those are really changing, and that becomes part of students' identity while they're with us. And I think it can be a really positive part of their identity if there's a skilled professional body working with academics as well to kind of help students to notice that they're doing these things and that they're doing them well. And it's not illicit to do patch writing or to collaborate on a WhatsApp group. It's all part of learning to have your own style of learning that will take you throughout life.
And we know that those are things that also profoundly affect well-being as well. I mean, writing, for example, particularly at doctoral level, there's a massive relationship between people's well-being and where they are in their writing or not, and all the other things you mentioned about some of those skills. We know there's a massive connection with well-being.
I suppose there's still a challenge that for a lot of people, teaching in universities is still about telling. And you know, that feeds on from us employing people who are experts in their subject area, and then, you know, we bolt on the PG cert and say, oh, well, now you've joined us, go and do that, but then come back to the discipline, and you know, and I think there's a job to do for universities to counter that and to marry the two, because for me the best is when you've got these wonderful enthusiastic experts able to communicate, you know, and to share that enthusiasm. And I mean, I've got 3 children, and I can remember a couple of times my kids coming home from school and saying things like, we really like Miss So-and-so, the only problem, she's really nice, but she can't teach. It used to make me smile. That, that was seen as, you know, oh well, moving on, you know. So I think we've still got some work to do within the kind of culture of universities to marry the two.
But doesn't that come back a little bit to what you're saying right at the beginning about excellence being disciplinary? Because having worked in learning and teaching units, I know when that work flies and feels positive and productive is when you're just asking the right questions. You're not telling people, put this in your curriculum, we've got a checkbox. It's got you're saying, what does it look like in your subject when your students are doing peer review, or you know, when they are you know, integrating concepts or whatever it might be. What does it look like for you when you're developing students' digital capability? That means that's, you know, it's a question I ask all the time. I don't want to tell people, I want to hear what it looks like. And I think that those questions take a lot of time and space and commitment to answer. You know, you've got to give professionals time to think and answer questions and get it wrong and try something else. And you've got to give that investment in staff development. I mean, I'm a governor at a secondary school, and the one question we ask constantly on the standards committee is, what's the staff development input? And how is staff morale? There's there are two questions, not one. But the two questions, you know, what's the implication for staff? So where's their development coming from, and how are staff receiving this? And universities need to ask those questions about everything as well. You know, particularly the second one about staff morale. Because without staff morale, none of it's going to happen excellently, is it?
But to go back to your question about leadership or management, I agree it's difficult to differentiate sometimes between the two. And to use the example from our MOOC in the University of Southampton, I was head of school at the time when we set that up, and I guess I had the freedom to say, I'm going to spend my time doing this. And I had to sort of, if you like, role model that sort of, I will spend my time doing this in the spaces around the edges, because it's not core to our curriculum, it's a bit, you know, risky, we don't know whether anyone's going to like it or watch it. It took off, we ran it 10 times, and we've just refreshed all the material, and I'm really excited to see that the new refresh has about 10 of my colleagues contributing in a really different way, because I guess they've seen that it's legitimate use of their time. The benefits will flow, but not immediately. They can use it in many different ways. So I guess that's leadership, but it's also a bit of management. It's a bit of maybe manipulative management to sort of say, this does come good, but it's a long game. It might take 4 years to do that before you really see the benefits. So I think both are important, and we have to
management willingness, isn't it, to give that time and be prepared to trust you and wait for it.
But it doesn't. You don't get immediate sort of returns, if you like. Whereas you might get much more immediate return by refreshing your lecture with some cool, whizzy digital thing that will give you a fantastic modular evaluation and get you promoted.
I wish it was that simple.
Did you feel as a sort of leader manager that you had the time sort of at the level above you to give people the time to show the results, or was it the pressure to have the results more quickly?
I think there's been pressure to sort of, there's been these questions, why are we bothering with this? Are MOOCs really working? Surely it was a fad that everyone's moved on from. And I guess then I've had to demonstrate that actually the benefits are multiple, that it's not just, you know, MOOCs haven't worked out the way we perhaps envisaged them back in the sort of 2012, 13. They're very, very different. And so I've had to tell a different narrative, but I think as long as you can tell that story of like, actually the benefits are here, the benefits of the 147 countries we're reaching that we hadn't reached before, they're the 47,000 learners that have looked at this that haven't. So I think it's about being on, and again that's probably leadership, it's about being able to tell the stories and just move it forward. Maybe not in the way you thought you were going originally.
She made a nice point earlier when we were talking downstairs that the audience for that MOOC isn't necessarily what you might have expected it to be.
It's evolved as well, So
much more.
Because Future Learn was a subsidiary of the Open University, our initial 10,000 learners were very open university demographics, sort of you know, retired people from the UK, middle class. And I think what we've seen is the numbers have decreased, because we've seen off all those, but we've got much more global reach, and we're seeing people from many different countries engaging, people that have never even seen the ocean, some of them. So they've never actually seen the sea, and they're getting involved. People of all ages, people of very, very different types. And so again, but that's a 4-year journey, 5-year journey to get, so you've got to keep going at it. If we'd have stopped after run 2, because that hadn't worked, we wouldn't have seen any of this.
Never have happened, Well, that's quite instructive generally, isn't it? That sometimes things just need that amount of time. But I mean, I feel like we're in an era of delayed gratification is gone. I don't know if you know the experiment with the children and the marshmallows. It feels like everyone's eating the marshmallow now. Nobody wants to wait for the 2 marshmallows. They want it now. I can relate to that actually.
Feeling hungry.
But how do we make space? I mean, you're the token manager here, Julie. So I won't blame you. But, is it just time that people need as well? I gave a talk last week and I asked the question of the audience. It was about collaboration. What would have made this collaboration work better? And the number one result was more time. I should have said don't say time. You're not allowed to say time. So everybody says time, but is there anything?
It's a strange thing, isn't it, in academia, because it's a profession where we have more control of our time than many others actually. I've been reading The Slow Professor. I'm sure many people have looked at that, and it is a sort of reminder that another way is possible, and you could choose to do X rather than Y, and you know, that's not to say that we haven't got a lot of pressure on us. You know, I've promised someone a chapter in a book, and I'm doing a keynote in a few weeks' time, and meanwhile my teaching's going on and the students are emailing me. I recognise all of that, but we do have choices, and so that, I think that's one thing, to help people think through those choices. But I think time is key, and of course we've just revalidated all our undergraduate programmes. I've led that. I'm probably the most hated person in the university for leading that. But we were forging time out of busy schedules to do lots of things we've talked about today. Think about assessment, think about personal knowing at the centre, think about internationalisation, think about research engaged teaching. And the feedback from people has been that they've actually enjoyed it once they've done it. For some, it was the first time the team had got together and thought about year 1, year 2, year 3, and how it all fits together. And so we forged time for that, and I recognise it was really tiring and hard work. But yeah, the feedback is that once we found that time, people sort of appreciated it.
I think it's, I totally agree in terms of, and actually making actual physical time and structures in, so having been on sabbatical for a few months, I know how important this is, and that's why I'm a fan of lectures as well, in terms of actually having a space and a place and time where something can happen. So the process you were describing, you know, it had to be put in people's diaries, didn't it, in order to create those meetings, and otherwise all our good intentions just sort of slip. So I mean, in terms of creating spaces in university timetables for CPD weeks or curriculum reviews, I think that's absolutely essential. But if you want something to happen, it's like writing time, isn't it? Projected writing time. You know, you've got to put it in your schedule and treat it as if it's an appointment or a meeting. And the same, I think, with all these really important things we're talking about. They've got to be in there and made physical, labelled, and then hopefully they will happen. Although it does. I don't know, sometimes we expect these things or hope they'll happen more naturally and organically, but I think as a starting point, we have to do.
Absolutely.
Is that where we need kind of, I don't know, I don't particularly like the word entrepreneurs, but I think a lot of these kind of para-academic roles that are often in learning and teaching centres, but in other places as well, you know, the library, you know, and you know, education development, and sometimes in careers, people have specialist expertise about things that need to be in the curriculum. And those roles, I think, a lot of universities now are seeing them as having a subject dimension. So it's not just coming in with a generic, and this comes back to our is excellence generic or specific. It's not just kind of people coming in with a generic, this is our strategy, this is what excellence looks like here, but actually having some subject expertise themselves so they can translate that or help the process of translation. So what does it look like? Actually, what does it look like? Let's not arrive with internationalisation, digital, assessment reform, you know, your list of... Let's arrive with a question. What's this curriculum doing? Why is it doing that? Oh, have you thought about, you know, and make it much more integrated and more holistic, and make the conversation a more, you know, egalitarian one of people with professional expertise to share. And I think that takes investment, doesn't it? You know, that those people don't grow on trees. No. They are nurtured carefully within institutions as well as so it's time, but it's also investing, I think, in some of that professional expertise as well.
And those roles are sometimes the ones that can create those spaces in academics' diaries, I think, by organising sort of structured things that we can sign up to and make place for.
It's a cultural thing, isn't it? As much as anything, it's about saying that it's okay, it's allowed, and it's expected that you will put that into your diary and treat it as a sacred thing as much as you're teaching.
Definitely.
That you should, of course, you should make time to meet with your team. Of course, you should make time to write, or even just read. Just sit
Or
for an hour.
evaluate changes you've made.
Or have a think.
Yeah, have
Go
a think.
for a walk and
Yeah.
think. I mean, we're very lucky. Having a walk around the park, I've quite often done that and come back and thought, I must write that down. I've
Yeah.
thought about it now.
Yeah.
But it's being able to feel that you can, as well as physically be able to, I think. So, yeah, maybe we need to have some good role models who are putting those expectations on their colleagues or their teams.
Yeah.
Just an idea.
I suppose I could be provocative and say, does the term or idea excellence help us do that better? Are there other words
it's
or
a
other? I'm not
motivator.
saying it doesn't, but I'm just interested in whether it is, you know, whether excellence is a useful. Does it open doors? Does it carve out the space? Does it create the resource to employ the right people, or are there other terms? Because I did a little. We were just discussing the history of excellence, and you know when it started being used as a kind of policy term, and it goes back to the 90s really, but I think possibly, and I haven't looked into this deeply, but it seems to come into use at a time when democratisation, massification was really taking off. So I guess when 5% of the population went to university, we didn't have to talk about excellence because clearly you had excelled just to get there. And then at a point where we're trying to say, actually, we want those excellent resources and opportunities much more widely available, we have to start defending that they are excellent. And that's where the discourse of excellence kind of starts, and then we get it in, you know, the HEA's mission and in national teaching fellowships and so on. But I'm just interested in whether it's still doing that work for us, and whether the tensions between, you know, democratisation of excellent opportunity or kind of more league table approach have become so extreme that we need to find some other way of talking about it. I don't have the answer. You're meant to ask the questions, Corinna. I'm just throwing that one in.
It's an open discussion.
I guess there's a related issue as well of whether everyone can be excellent, because I guess I've always assumed that they could, but clearly under schemes like TEF and so on, they can't, because there are quotas of excellence. But yeah, that principle that everyone could be seems to be slipping away a little bit, maybe.
But then if everybody's excellent, is that not just normal? What then is excellent? Is there a space for excellence? Maybe we need to dump it.
Post-excellent world.
Post-excellent world. Where would you go? Where would you go from there?
Well, there is
I could get into child psychology. Good enough is a really good concept in child psychology, child development. You know, good enough is just what the developing human being needs to get to where they're going.
Satisfactory.
Winnicott.
It's, I suppose these terms just become systematically devalued, don't they? So I'm sure we're going into something else when the same thing will happen. But I mean, it's fascinating the history of those sort of terminologies and where it all comes from.
Yeah, and you know, and overlying that is that sort of business model of strategy and outcomes and measurable targets and all of that as well. Is now being critiqued. You know, that has to overlay it as well, I think. But in terms of what we replace it with, I think that is a tricky question actually, and I'm not going to pretend I've got an answer for that, I'm afraid.
I don't think the good enough teaching framework is really going to fly, is it?
No.
It would be really hard to make an acronym out of it.
Where has
almost
current Ofsted ones? They've been around the houses a bit, haven't they? It's outstanding.
I think it's still outstanding and good.
Yes, it is.
Isn't it? Yeah.
But they talk about breadth and challenge. And
Oh, that's it. Yeah.
The
Breadth and challenge, again, that's more quality. You could make that qualitative. So I was wondering, thought of this a while ago, and it stayed in my head, so it must be important. If you were university's minister for a week, give you time to do something, would you scrap league tables?
I think it's so ingrained, we make them up ourselves. So even if we sort of banned them, they'd become sort of illicit things anyway. Because I think we saw that with the ref, didn't we? That everybody can manage to create some sort of metric out of the ref that allows them to say they're fabulous.
That's right.
And so we do it to ourselves. So I think actually that horse is bolted, you know, and somehow we need to perhaps shift the culture, and banning them won't help.
Yes, a parent here at an open day last year said, I've been to 6 universities and everybody's the top 10 in something.
Absolutely.
but I'm certainly not a fan of league tables. I mean, universities are categorised in certain ways anyway, aren't they? The world leading, the Oxford and Cambridge there, you know, the more employment focused universities, or, you know, the universities that are more community focused or focus on civic engagement. You know, I think they all have their place, and I don't like to see them in that kind of hierarchy. I just think they're all very different, and we need a range of universities.
There's lots of dangers, aren't there? There's the danger of diversity becoming stratification.
Yes.
And there's the danger of something that's very complex. I mean, what we've been talking around is incredibly complicated, and you know, we were using those words, but situated and emergent and often only seen in retrospect. Yeah. And we're reducing it to often a single metric, as though that's kind of going to answer the problem for us. It's interesting, I helped develop a survey that JISC runs now as the Insight Survey about the student digital experience. And I could say on the one hand, well, we really set out not to create a league table, and what we found was that institutions were massively interested in benchmarking themselves. But then that is the culture. Yeah. But actually what we don't publish those benchmarks at all. We make those benchmarks internally available so that institutions can say, they can look at their comparators or their sector and say, okay, on these issues we seem to be falling short in some ways, let's investigate that further. And we give a lot of guidance about how to use it in that way. And I think that, you know, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking students for feedback and asking students to talk about their experience, if that's, you know, a quick way of doing it. But I think as soon as it enters a league table, it has a life of its own that can be used to, you know, basically can be used to beat people over the head with if they're not doing certain. They're very good drivers of organisational behaviour, league tables, but whether they're good drivers of meaningful change is another question.
Goes back to what I can't remember who's mentioned it earlier, but the idea of using the metrics as an opportunity for personal or institutional reflection. Seems to be probably the best use of them, rather than a straight ranking, which does wipe out a lot of diversity. And the idea that a university might not be worth it. I mean, it's a university. Of course it's worth it. Of course it is. And they've all got something, they've all got a strength. So it's finding a way to make the most of that without destroying the nuances that make them unique, I guess. Don't know where I was going with that.
I think you were going back to the values led.
I was, wasn't I? It is about values.
I think
it is about values. And
but it is also about value for money. And there is, you know,
we couldn't get away with that.
We have to accept that there is a policy dimension around that and a responsibility actually for public institutions. I think we are still public institutions one way or another, the way student fees come to us. And so we have to recognise that those questions are going to be asked. You know, I think you said, of course they're worth it. I think we still have to work quite hard actually to show that they are worth it.
But I think now the fees regime has kind of been shown to still largely be a form of public funding. It's easier for us to argue for universities as a form of public good and defend our value for money on that basis rather than an individual good that, you know, students are getting massively in debt, and if they don't immediately get some payback on that, we've failed them.
True.
You know, I actually think that it does open it opens the discussion up again about well, why have universities at all? You know, the idea of the university is under significant threat. We're sitting here as though we're just talking about, you know, but actually the whole idea of universities from some parts of the political spectrum, the idea of peer review, the idea of collegiality, the idea of it being worth taking time out to study and to improve your life chances is under threat. And you know, we need to know what we think we're about to answer those questions about what is the role of the university as a public home for our most valued knowledge and our valuable knowledge practices and our teaching and our nurturing of young people in a certain point in their lives. What is the value of that? And we have to be able to answer that, or we will, not just one or two universities, we will be, as a sector, in trouble.
So, is excellence the right word, do you think? For anything. Teaching and learning, if you like, but anything.
I think I go back to we know it when we see it. I mean, so we do, but defining it's the hard bit. and we know what the opposite of it is.
Yeah.
We ask that question. Mediocrity is not where we want to be.
True. Yeah.
So we can answer that. So it's a good word in that way. There's a scale, mediocre to excellent.
Yeah.
But the devil's in the detail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're getting confused with rankings, I think. It's become too tied up with rankings rather than being considered about what it is as a concept or a good in itself. So, yeah, once you start having to just put it in a rank, then I think you sort of lose the values underpinning what you're actually looking for and what the purpose of doing it is.
Yeah.
I'd say TEF's put teaching on the agenda like never before, and the student experience of learning, and that's got to be a good thing.
Absolutely.
And I think when you say we know it when we see it, what that does is puts professional judgment back in the frame. You know, if we know it when we see it, well, let's rely on peer review.
Yeah.
You know, let's rely on trusted methods.
Yeah.
Let's rely on, are we investing in our teaching staff? You know, let's trust the profession to understand itself as a profession, to improve itself, to transform itself continuously. And you know, I would say that leads to excellence. I mean, I'm afraid it comes back to inputs rather than outcomes. But as a profession, that is what you live and die by.
And actually, the NSS tells us that mostly students are satisfied with what they get. You know, that's not a measure we chose, but nationally, students seem pretty happy with what they're getting. So that's something we should be proud of.
Absolutely. Well, that feels like a good place to end. I heard lots of good stuff about values, transformation, personal connection, space for connection and reflection and communication. And those all seem like really good things. So if we can point towards those, I think we're doing all right. So I'd like to thank you all very, very much. We were talking about time, and here you are, sitting here giving up your afternoon. I really appreciate you all coming in. It's been really a privilege to talk to you and hear your thoughts on this subject. So thank you very much. And while I'm saying thank you, I want to thank Mr. Ed Bolton, our learning technologist, who stepped in with a team of interns to replace Paul Maple, who isn't here today and who is our usual tech guru. You look much calmer than Paul. Maybe, I don't know why. But well done. I think this has gone really well, and it's been great. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Livecast will return.